Hello everyone. Once again I am back with one more poem, that is the love song of J.Alfred Prufrock. But before I get into the text and start explaining you line by line this very particular poem, first of all I would like to tell you something about the background, the composition, the year of the composition, so on and so forth. That will help you a lot to understand this very particular complicated, difficult poem. Why? Because this is one among the most difficult poems of the 20th century. Why? Because lots of allusions, lots of direct, indirect references from this work, that work. Why? Because you know that the, the poet of this poem is none other than T.S. Eliot, Thomas Sterne Eliot, who gets the credit of writing the Wasteland, one among the most difficult poems of the 20th century. You all of know about T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot, who wrote an essay, Tradition and Individual Talent. He says that a poet does not write in isolation. A poet somehow is connected to the past, carries the legacy of the past, but by using his individual talent or her individual talent, he or she portrays, or he or she describes, or he or she paints the portrait, composes the poem in absolute different manner, where by no way one can find the personality of that very particular poet, though he carries forward that legacy of Shakespeare, of Dante, and Milton, and so many other great poets, but somehow he succeeds in separating himself from his own work in a beautiful manner. So here he is carrying forward that legacy, that tradition, but he does not allow his own personality somehow to peep through his work, to speak through his work, to reflect through his work. Here, this poem I did not tell, yes, I think I told you that this poem was written when Eliot was a student in Harvard in 1910-11 around. This poem, published in 1917 as as a part of the poem of his first collection, that is Prufrock and Other Observation, 1917. And this poem reflects or deals with all those complications, mental, psychological, physical, the middle-aged people of the Boston society underwent. Next, very, very important thing, that this very particular poem is a dramatic monologue. To some extent, we should call it anterior monologue. Generally, what happens in dramatic monologue? We have a speaker. We have an imaginary speaker, and that imaginary speaker has an imaginary or imaginary listeners, and he addresses that imaginary listeners in out loud manner. But in anterior monologue, it does not happen. The speaker of the poem, or that speaker of the anterior monologue, actually splits into two halves. Here the same happens. The speaker of the poem splits his personality into two halves. One real, the other imaginary or romantic. And the poet uses, in this very particular poem, uses the stream of consciousness technique that was probably popularized, maybe first of all, this technique was actually, I think, used by um, James Joyce in his just work. You can say that portrait of an artist as a young man, and like you see this then Virginia Woolf in her own novels just made use of this technique. And what does happen in a stream of consciousness technique, or using a stream of consciousness technique? Actually, the poet or the writer of the poem tries to study that flow of the thought of the characters of his work. That how do the thoughts flow? How do the thoughts flow in the mind of the characters? Here we see, here he does not speak anything out loud, but here he is silently speaking to himself. His one self is speaking to his other self, second self. This is stream of consciousness technique. How does, for a moment, this moment, the speaker speaks or thinks about the present. Very next moment, thinks about the past. And very next moment switches to the future and then back to the present. This goes on and on and on and on. Why? Because generally it happens that for a moment we think about present, and we take no second or no minute to think about our past, think about our future. This way we just juggle with present and past and future. Same thing here this very particular character does. And in order to capture that reality, the real flow of the thought, the poet here, T.S.Eliot, makes use of the stream of consciousness technique. Why? Because his character here juggles with present, past and future, juggles a lot. This moment he thinks this, the next moment thinks that. This goes on and on. Next thing that is also very, very important, that the poet makes use of lots of allusions. Third, the title of the poem is what? Absolutely ironical or absolutely paradoxical. Why? Because no love song. The speaker of the poem is a middle-aged man, struggling with lots of mental, psychological and physical ailments or complications and problems, and somehow trying to overcome. Here, the speaker, I told you, is a middle-aged man, but unfortunately, you can say that, or coincidentally, has fallen for a young girl, half his age. He is probably 45, 50, a middle-aged man, but fallen for a girl half his age. Fallen for a girl means he has fallen in love with a girl half his age, maybe 20, maybe 25. Here, this poem describes a journey. What kind of a journey? Not a kind of a physical journey, but a kind of a mental and psychological journey. And how does this journey go? How is the physical journey time and again postponed or called off? Because of this, because of that. So now let's start this poem, that is the love song of J.Alfred Prufrock. But before I get into the text, one thing that I missed to share with you, I would like to share, that is the poem begins with the epigraph, epigraph. Epigraph, you can say introduction, kind of a quotation, and that is Eliot borrows from Dante's Inferno, Inferno. Inferno, probably just an Italian word, stand for hell. Dante has written a poem, Divina Commedia, Divine Comedy, and there is a part in this poem, Divine Comedy, that is Inferno, in which actually Dante, being a living person, just goes deep down into the hell. And when he goes down deep into the hell, there, when he visits there he sees horrible kind of a condition. He sees the sinners, those criminals who committed lots of crime in their earthly life on the earth. He sees them suffering endlessly, limitlessly. Dante has an encounter with a certain person, maybe Guido or some other name, and they have a kind of an interaction. Why? Because Guido, that very particular character that he meets in the hell, knows one thing for sure, that the person he is talking to is a sinner like him and is dead like him. And being dead, being an emit of the hell, he cannot get back to the earth. And may just tell the people there that related to all that, or related to this all, like just cannot just speak about, cannot tell the others about this very particular character in the hell, this and that. So he lays bare his heart in front of what? Dante, thinking that he is just like him. He's also a sinner. He's also dead. He is the part of the world of the deads. So he confesses. He tells him all about his sins, all about his crimes, all about his wrongdoings. And that's why, see, I told you that Eliot believed in carrying forward the legacy. So here he is carrying forward the legacy, that tradition of Dante, tradition of Shakespeare and all. And that's why here it starts the poem with this epigraph, in which the character a certain sinner in the hell makes a confession or making a confession. And here, Prufrock, you can say that, who represents the 20th century man, stands for 20th century man, also makes a kind of a confession. But this confession is made to none other than his second self. Just as Guido there knows one thing, that very particular character knows one thing, that Dante cannot get back to the earth and can defame him by just rumorizing or telling people about his crimes and sins. In the same manner here, Prufrock knows one thing for sure, that if he is confessing, if he is letting somebody know about his complications and problems, that somebody is none other than his second self. So now let's look at these few lines of this poem. How does it begin? See this. Let us go then, you and I. So see how the poem begins. Abruptly, it means there was a long thought, lots of deliberation and thinking, and then here you and I decide to start. Say, let's go then, you and I. So let's start. You, I told you, you here and I. For a moment you will think you is the readers, I speaker, but no. I told you this Prufrock is a split character. He is split. He is divided into two halves. I stand for the probably real one, you stand for his romantic one. This. When the evening is spread out against the sky. So, you and I will go. Now, it seems that you and I, they are going somewhere. These two characters are going somewhere where nobody knows. At present, we don't know where are you and I go. But for one thing, remember, this you and I, none other than Prufrock himself. Why? Because he is a split one. Anterior monologue. He is speaking to his second self. He is divided into two halves. One half speaks to the other. One, I real, you romantic. When the evening is spread out against the sky, when they will go? When Prufrock will go? When will Prufrock go? When will Prufrock start? When the evening will come. When the day will almost be over. When the day will almost be over, and evening will be as calm as an authorized patient. Authorized patient, that very particular patient who is given a dose of ether. E-T-H-E-R. Ether is a kind of anesthesia. Is a kind of a drug that is given to a patient who is to be operated. So see how your evening is compared. See how the poem begins in a romantic, beautiful manner, but abruptly we see that evening is compared to authorized patient. Just like the authorized patient does not know what is going to happen to him, is going to be operated upon, and before going to be operated, his body will be cut open. His body will be cut open. In the same manner, this evening will also be cut open. This evening will also be cut into pieces. All romance and all that pleasant, beautiful, just a approach of thinking, an approach of understanding here cancelled out. Like a patient authorized upon the table. So see, 20th century poem, and that's why science here you see this. Let's go through the certain half deserted streets. Now he has already planned. He has already planned what way, what are the places he will go through to that very particular place he wants to go. He has a planned journey. Already he has made a plan of going to some place, and he has already in his own mind what are those places he will go through to that place. That is half deserted streets. He will go to that very particular place, taking those streets that would be half empty. Means he would not take those streets that are very much crowded. No, he will take those streets that would not be greatly crowded, but rather empty. The muttering retreats, and the streets he will go through will have lots of cheap hotels, and the rooms of those cheap hotels full of lots of complaining sounds. Those people just book their room in those cheap hotels would not be happy at all with the service of those cheap hotels, so would be muttering, complaining. Retreats, those places you see, these cheap hotels, of restless night in one night, cheap hotels, and lots of hotels there. What kind of hotel? Cheap hotels. And those cheap hotels would not be at all at peace even in the night time. Lots of hustle and bustle and noise, even in the dead of the night, in the rooms of those cheap hotels. See how he is painting the picture of the 20th century America during or just before the World War, during World War, or just before the World War. That there were hotels which opened all through the night. People could be seen talking, drinking, complaining all through the night in those cheap hotel rooms, so on and so forth. Restless night in one, restless nights, actually night not restless, people in those nights were restless. So beautiful example of transfer epithet. And sawdust restaurants with oyster shells, and he talks about those restaurants with the lots of wooden work, oyster shells used particularly for the shaking off or just setting aside the ashes of the cigarettes and all. Streets that follow like a tedious, very confusing argument of insidious, something that is dark intent, desire. So he says that those streets that he will go through are very much confusing, just like an argument. if you start an argument, if we start an argument with somebody, very soon that argument starts taking this turn, that turn. Why? Because you speak something, I speak something, and the other speaks something, and very soon that argument becomes very much messy, very much confusing, very much difficult to understand. In the same manner, those streets he will take will be very much confusing and complicated. Very much complicated streets. One street takes a sharp turn and gets into the another street, and that street into the another, and so on and so forth. So the streets he has decided to take, those streets are absolutely confusing and messy, just like a tedious, boring argument, to lead you to an overwhelming, that avoiding, that very much confusing or problem giving question. And he says that if he takes, if one argument leads to the another argument and to the another, and so on and so forth, and the argument becomes very much confusing and complicated. In the same manner, when he starts, he will take one street, then that street will take to this second, third, fourth, fifth, and it will become very confusing. And if he starts thinking about all that, all these will lead to a certain question, and that certain question he wants to skip, he wants to avoid. And what is this question? We'll get to learn in the next part of this poem. That's it in this video, dear learners.